I wanted to spend a little time talking about chapter 4 of Joseph Harris's rewriting. It's a chapter called Taking an Approach. The first time I read through this chapter, I thought, well, I'm not sure it's all that relevant to what the students are doing here in the Rhetorics of Everyday Life. On rereading it, I can see some value to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you my thoughts on the various pages. And so what I did was I made a Google slideshow, and so I'll be putting those slides up interspersed between me talking to you. So basically, he describes taking an approach as working in the mode of another writer. And this would make sense if, let's say, you were going to be doing a Marxist analysis of a certain rhetorical artifact, and so you could kind of, address things the way Marx does. It might also make sense if you were looking at let's say you were looking at a work of fiction by Charles Dickens, and you kind of took a Dickensian approach. You looked at kind of things that Dickens would look at, and it didn't seem to make quite as much sense with the kind of rhetorical artifacts that many of you are working with. He uses this analogy of a cover song, how a cover song can actually change the meaning of a song. So he says he's got three strategies that he wants to talk about. And here it starts to make sense for the projects that you're doing. One is acknowledging influences, noting those writers whose work has in some way provided a model for your own. So, he talks about acknowledging influences, turning an approach on itself, and reflexivity. So, acknowledging influences is the simplest one and makes sense. The turning an approach on itself, that's where you're asking the same questions of a writer that he or she asks of others. And then reflexivity, noting and reflecting on the key choices you have made concerning methods, values, languages in constructing your text. And now this is starting to make sense with the kind of projects that you're doing. So, acknowledging influences, that's where you are defining concerns. So, the things that you are concerned with in your artifact might be one that some influential author or rhetor sort of helped you define. And then what are the characteristic methods? The characteristic methods used by one author when they created a certain film, or when they created a body of visual arts, or when they produced some kind of a statement. So how did they go about it? And then finally, there's the question of style. So he's got a second page on acknowledging influences, and it's the tactics. He talks about acknowledging the deep influences, and this is where it gets a little fuzzy. So it is possible that one or more of you may have been, profoundly influenced by the rhetor that produced the artifact that you're looking at. And then you could define how those influences have directed your work, but also show how your approach diverges from theirs. And so that then is starting to make more sense, as if you were looking at, say, maybe a historical text or a sociological text or a political text. In many cases, I can't see the use value of this approach. Turning an approach on itself, Harris uses the example of The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand, in which the author compares four pragmatist philosophers, Holmes, James, Peirce, and Dewey, using the very same pragmatic approach that the subjects of his book invented. So, again, this does not seem to be terribly relevant to what you are doing. But now reflexivity does start to make sense. Harris writes, I have so far described the conscious taking of an approach as a way of situating your own project in relation to the defining methods and concerns of other writers. But there are often other sorts of influences on your writing that you need to reckon with as well. One of the characteristic features of academic writing is its reflexivity, those moments in a text when a writer, reflects on the choices that she or he has made in taking certain approaches or in making use of a particular term. Such reflexive moves, though not always, are made near the beginning of a text as a kind of clearing of space for the writer's project. And then Harris talks about being dogged by worries about bias. Harris describes writers torn between striving for, quote, a distanced and impartial view of their subjects, unquote, and, quote, the reason for writing in the first place, which is to explore the subject that matters in some real way to us, close quote. He cites Harry Braverman and Doris Kearns Goodwin as examples of writers who owned their personal histories with their subjects while still applying the diligence and rigor of scholarship. So those two authors, he talks about how their personal sort of involvement in the subject could make them tend to be biased in one way or another, and yet they are scholars who are serious about doing unbiased work. So that means they first have to acknowledge their personal investment in the subject and then possibly work against that to make sure that they didn't go overboard with their passion for the subject or their anger and resentment about the subject. Finally, Harris turns to the problem of language. Harris tells of Bruno Bettelheim's complaint about the translators who turned Freud's everyday German words, das Es and das Ich, into the Latin terms, the id and the ego. So it turns out Freud had picked two everyday German words in order to talk about these two parts of his three-part analysis of the unconscious. And the people who translated it from German turned those into the id and the ego, which are rather foreign and esoteric sounding words. So Bettelheim says this was a mistake. They blew it when they chose to use those words instead of what should have been the is and the it and the I. All right? And then he talks about Christopher Hitchens' choice of contrarian over dissident, maverick, rebel, and iconoclast, and Barbara Ehrenreich's thoughtful choice of the professional middle class. So here are cases where the authors had to pick some terms to talk about their subject, and they had to be careful to not pick terms that maybe were already freighted in one direction or another, or terms that didn't do justice to their new take on a subject. Harris goes on to say, this is why so much of this book is given over to what is sometimes called metatext, text about text, writing about writing, moments when a writer calls attention to the terms he is using or the moves he is making. And that, I think, is sort of the most important thing that Chapter 4 has to offer you as a person who's engaged in academic scholarship. Metatext. Indeed, I'd argue that the use of metatext characterizes academic writing. Metatext often takes the form of brief phrases that orient your readers to the moves you are making in an essay. And he gives 4 examples. My aim here is. Perhaps an example will help to show. A problem with this line of thinking is. I will draw on the ideas of blank. So this is the kind of metatext that serves as a signpost in your work to help your reader, know where you're going. A note on acknowledgments. Harris writes, constraints are acknowledged so they can be responded to. Influences are noted in order to be transformed. And those are 2 important points. Finally, the final point. In addition to the influences of the rhetors who produce the artifacts you are analyzing, you might also acknowledge Sonia K. Foss and the critical approaches she explained, for example, feminist approach, generic approach, ideological approach, metaphoric approach, or narrative approach. So I hope that has helped sort of take what Harris has written and make it possibly applicable to what you are writing.